The clinking of Waterford crystal champagne flutes echoed through the cavernous expanse of the grand ballroom at the Waldorf Astoria. It was a sound I had endured for exactly 35 years. The delicate, expensive noise of the ultra-wealthy congratulating themselves on their own existence. Tonight, under the blinding, fractured light of 3 colossal baccarat crystal chandeliers, 300 of New York's most elite socialites, politicians, and business magnates were gathered to celebrate the sapphire anniversary of Richard and Evelyn Sterling. To the outside world, we were the undisputed king and queen of Manhattan real estate. Richard was the ruthless, charismatic titan who had carved his name into the city's skyline, and I was the quiet, dutiful wife who stood perfectly still in his shadow. I was the woman who wore the designer gowns, smiled for the flashbulbs, hosted the suffocating charity galas, and kept my mouth shut. The air in the ballroom was thick, heavy with the scent of roasted duck, white truffles, and the overwhelming perfume of thousands of imported, rare blue orchids that cascaded from every table in elaborate, towering centerpieces. It was a flawless display of immense, unadulterated wealth. And like everything else in Richard's life, it was entirely designed to feed his insatiable ego. I sat at the center of the sprawling head table, draped in a custom-tailored emerald silk gown that felt more like a beautifully constructed prison uniform than a celebration of love. My posture was impeccably straight. My face was a mask of serene, polite interest. But beneath the table, resting quietly in my lap, my hands were steady. There was no tremor of anxiety. There was only the cold, hard certainty of a woman who had spent the last decade quietly sharpening a blade in the dark. The low hum of conversation suddenly died down as the heavy oak doors to the kitchen swung shut and a hush fell over the room. At the center of the dais, Richard pushed his chair back. The legs scraped harshly against the imported marble floors, a jagged sound that demanded everyone's immediate attention. He stood up, adjusting the lapels of his bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his jaw set with that familiar, arrogant arrogance that had terrorized boardrooms and our home alike for 3.5 decades. He picked up his champagne flute and tapped it with a silver spoon. Ding, ding, ding. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard's voice boomed through the state-of-the-art sound system, dripping with the kind of smug self-assurance that only comes from a lifetime of unchecked privilege. If I could have your attention. Faces turned toward him with rapt, sycophantic devotion. The room was utterly silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. 35 years, Richard began, pacing slowly behind the long table, looking out over the sea of faces. 35 years ago, I took a massive gamble. I was a young, hungry developer with nothing but a vision, and I married a small-town girl with nothing but a pretty face. A low rumble of polite, practiced laughter rippled through the ballroom. I did not blink. I kept my eyes fixed forward, my expression frozen in a pleasant, vacant smile. Everyone told me more laughter, louder this time. A few of his golfing buddies at table 4 actually cheered. My own daughter, sitting 3 seats down, stared at her plate, too cowardly to meet my eyes. Richard stopped pacing and turned to look down at me, but I was generous. The laughter in the room abruptly died. The atmosphere shifted from celebratory to deeply uncomfortable. Guests shifted in their velvet-upholstered chairs, exchanging nervous, wide-eyed glances. But Richard didn't care. He was intoxicated by his own perceived power. He was high on the delusion that he owned me, body and soul. He leaned over the table, bringing his face so close to mine I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. He lowered his voice, but the microphone carried his cruel words to every single corner of the massive ballroom. "Let's be very honest tonight, Evelyn," he whispered, his eyes flashing with raw contempt. You have played your part. You looked nice on my arm. But you have never worked a day in your life. You have never built a single thing of value. You have simply consumed what I created. You are nothing, absolutely nothing, without my money. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. 160 high society guests froze in stunned, mortified silence. The humiliation was designed to be absolute. It was designed to break me, publicly and permanently, reducing me to a weeping, pathetic shell of a woman begging for his continued mercy. He smirked, standing up straight again, waiting for the tears. He waited for my chin to tremble. He waited for me to shrink into myself and run out of the heavy oak doors in shame. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not even frown. Instead, I took a slow, deep breath, perfectly savoring the exact moment his towering ego reached its absolute peak. Then, moving with the terrifying, deliberate grace of a predator that had finally cornered its prey, I stood up. My chair made no sound against the marble. I picked up my black Yves Saint Laurent clutch from the table. The sharp click of the golden clasp opening echoed like a gunshot in the dead silent room. I reached inside and pulled out a single, neatly folded sheet of thick, watermarked paper. Every eye in the room was glued to me. I walked slowly around the edge of the massive table, my heels clicking rhythmically, sharply against the floor. Click, click, click. I walked until I was standing directly in front of him. Richard's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. He held the microphone, entirely unsure of what to do with a reaction he hadn't scripted. Without breaking eye contact, I calmly laid the piece of paper on the mahogany table right in front of him. I pressed my index finger against the top edge and slowly slid it across the polished wood until it rested perfectly over his dinner plate. "Read it, Richard," I said. My voice was not amplified by a microphone, but the room was so deathly quiet that the words sliced through the air like a scalpel. He scoffed, rolling his eyes, but his gaze dropped to the paper. It was a certified, heavily redacted executive summary from a massive offshore private equity firm. The firm that had, over the past 72 hours, aggressively and quietly bought out every single one of his over-leveraged commercial loans. The firm that now held the absolute, indisputable deed to his entire, heavily indebted empire. At the bottom of the page, listed as the sole proprietor, CEO, and 100% majority shareholder of that private equity firm, was my maiden name. I watched the exact second his brain processed the numbers. I watched the blood completely drain from his arrogant, spray-tanned face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified old man. The microphone slipped from his fingers, hitting the table with a deafening thud that made half the room jump, before rolling onto the marble floor with a piercing shriek of feedback. He opened his mouth to speak, to scream, to demand an explanation, but his throat seized up. His hands began to shake violently, rattling the fine china on the table. I leaned in closely, placing my hands perfectly flat on the table, and whispered loudly enough for only him and the front row of gaping guests to hear. "You're right, Richard. I didn't build your empire." I smiled, a chilling, dead-eyed smile that promised absolute ruin. "I just bought it for pennies on the dollar, and as of 9 a.m. tomorrow, you are evicted." I turned my back on the man I had endured for 35 years, and I began to walk toward the exit. The real show was only just beginning, and by the time the sun rose over the Manhattan skyline, the world would finally know exactly who was funding the facade. The scene freezes. The dropped microphone hangs perfectly suspended in midair, a millimeter above the polished marble floor. The collective gasp of 160 elite guests is trapped in their throats. Richard's face is locked in a grotesque mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. The exact moment his inflated, tyrannical ego shatters into a million jagged pieces. The sprawling, opulent ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria, with its cascading blue orchids and blinding baccarat crystal chandeliers, is suddenly nothing more than a silent, paused diorama of sudden, devastating defeat. I step away from the table. The oppressive, heavy atmosphere of the room no longer touches me. I am no longer a participant in this circus. I am the director. I turn away from Richard's frozen, panicked eyes, and I look directly at you. Yes, you. There is a very specific, intoxicating kind of silence that follows the death of a narcissist's power. It does not sound like a peaceful quiet. It sounds like a vacuum. It sounds like the sudden, violent absence of a bully's life force being ripped from their lungs. It is the sound of a gilded cage finally rusting through and crumbling into dust. And if you are watching this, if you have clicked on this story and made it this far, I know with absolute certainty that you understand exactly what kind of silence I am talking about. You know the crushing, suffocating weight of being the designated punching bag in a family that demands your absolute loyalty while simultaneously offering you nothing but their absolute contempt. Look at Richard. Look at the impeccably tailored Tom Ford tuxedo, the silver hair, the spray-tanned skin that hides a soul so dark and deeply insecure that it has to feed on the light of others just to survive. How many Richards have you known in your own life? How many people have looked down their noses at you from the comfortable, unearned pedestals you helped build for them? For 35 years, I was told I was nothing. I was told that the food on my plate, the clothes on my back, and the very air I breathed in my own home were a generous charity provided by a man who saw me not as a partner, but as a possession. A prop. A quiet, compliant little accessory designed to make him look like a benevolent king. They use money. They use status, and they use the sacred concept of family as a heavy iron collar around your neck. They yank the chain every time you dare to stand up straight. They remind you of your place. They isolate you. They gaslight you until you look in the mirror and you do not even recognize the hollow, exhausted ghost staring back at you. But what they do not realize, what toxic, arrogant, profoundly stupid people never manage to comprehend, is that when you force someone into the shadows for decades, you are not destroying them. You are hiding them. You are giving them the perfect, undisturbed cover of darkness to quietly, methodically, and ruthlessly build an empire of their own. You give them the gift of underestimation. I want you to pause for a moment and look at your own life. Think about the family members who have smiled in your face while actively plotting your downfall. Think about the parents who handed the world to your lazy, entitled siblings while handing you a mop to clean up their messes. Think about the holidays ruined by passive-aggressive comments, the birthdays overshadowed by their tantrums, the immense, draining exhaustion of trying to be the bigger person in a room full of emotional toddlers who are actively trying to destroy your mental health. Society tells us that blood is thicker than water. Society tells us that we must forgive, that we must turn the other cheek, that we must keep the peace at all costs because they are family. I am here to tell you that society is wrong. Blood does not equal a blank check to abuse your spirit. Sharing DNA with someone does not give them a lifetime all-access pass to disrespect you, belittle you, or use you as a stepping stone for their own delusions of grandeur. True peace does not come from suffering in silence just to keep a toxic family comfortable. True peace the kind of peace that lets you sleep deeply at night and wake up with fire in your veins, only comes when you look your abuser dead in the eye, pack up your self-respect, and walk away. Or, in my case, when you buy the very ground they stand on and legally evict them from their own miserable existence. We are not victims. We are survivors who have endured the fire, and now we are the ones holding the matches. Before I unpause this room, before the microphone hits the marble, before the chaotic, humiliated screams of the Sterling family begin to echo through the Waldorf Astoria, and before I show you the absolute scorched earth devastation I unleashed upon the people who thought they could treat me like a footstool, I need to know who is standing in this room with me. I need to know who my allies are. Take a moment right now. Go down to the comments section and tell me exactly where you are watching from today. What city, what country, what state? Let's show the world how vast this network of survivors truly is. If you have ever had to bite your tongue while a toxic family member paraded their unearned arrogance around a dinner table, if you have ever been the scapegoat, the black sheep, the one who carried the heavy burdens while the golden child received all the glory, hit that like button right now. Let the algorithm know that we are done being silent. And most importantly, hit that subscribe button. Join this community. We are building an army of independent, fierce, self-made individuals who refuse to be manipulated by guilt trips and fake family loyalty. Subscribe so you never miss a lesson in setting ruthless boundaries, reclaiming your profound self-worth, and executing the kind of spectacular, undeniable success that serves as the ultimate revenge. Share this video with a friend, a sister, a brother, or a coworker who is currently drowning in the toxic swamp of their own family's dysfunction. Be the lifeline they need today. Let them see what happens when the scapegoat finally stops crying and starts buying. Are you ready to see the empire fall? Are you ready to watch the absolute, catastrophic panic of a man who suddenly realizes his entire life is owned by the woman he just publicly humiliated? Take a deep breath. Savor the anticipation. Because the financial slaughter that is about to happen in this magnificent, suffocating ballroom is going to be nothing short of cinematic perfection. To truly understand the absolute, unadulterated devastation I was about to unleash upon Richard in that opulent, suffocating ballroom, you have to understand how a woman allows herself to become a ghost in her own life for 3.5 decades. You have to understand the machinery of the trap. People do not just wake up one day and decide to accept a life of emotional starvation and daily humiliation. They are groomed for it. They are conditioned, systematically and ruthlessly, by the very people who were supposed to protect them. Before I was the silent, obedient trophy wife of a Manhattan real estate tyrant, I was a Vance. And in the aristocratic, fiercely competitive circles of Greenwich, Connecticut, being a Vance meant absolutely everything. Until the money ran out. My parents, Eleanor and Thomas Vance, were the architects of my first prison. They were people entirely consumed by the desperate, clawing need to maintain the illusion of generational wealth. Long after the family trusts had dried up and the grand, sprawling Victorian estate we lived in began to literally rot from the inside out. I can still remember the visceral, inescapable smell of that house. It was a deeply unsettling mixture of expensive, heavy floral perfumes, imported lemon polish, and the faint, unmistakable scent of damp, decaying wood hidden behind the priceless silk wallpaper. To the outside world, my parents were the picture of old money elegance. They hosted lavish garden parties, sat on the boards of prestigious charities, and sneered at anyone they deemed nouveau riche. But behind the heavy mahogany doors of our home, the reality was a terrifying landscape of bouncing checks, overdue notices, and a thick, suffocating cloud of frantic anxiety. And at the very center of this twisted, manicured delusion was my older brother, Preston. Preston was the golden child. He was the heir apparent to an empire of dust. From the moment he took his first breath, my parents looked at him and saw their salvation. They saw the handsome, charismatic son who would go to Princeton, marry an heiress, and secure the Vance legacy for another century. And because he was their golden ticket, the rules of reality simply did not apply to him. The contrast between how Preston was treated and how I was treated was not just stark. It was an act of daily psychological violence. When Preston turned 16, despite the fact that my parents were secretly refinancing the house to avoid foreclosure, they bought him a brand new midnight blue Porsche 911. I remember watching through the rain-streaked window of the library as they tied a massive silver bow to the hood, their faces flushed with pride. I was 14 at the time. I was wearing a threadbare winter coat that had belonged to a cousin, and my shoes had holes in the soles that let the icy Connecticut snow seep into my socks. When I dared to ask my mother for a new pair of boots that winter, she looked at me with eyes so cold and devoid of maternal warmth that it physically took my breath away. "Don't be so terribly selfish, Evelyn," she had hissed, adjusting her pearls. "Preston has his image to maintain. He is making connections. He is going places. You are just a girl. You need to learn to make do. You are just a girl. You need to learn to make do." That was my assigned role in the family script. I was not a daughter. I was the collateral damage. I was the built-in maid, the emotional punching bag, and the designated scapegoat for every single one of Preston's failures. When Preston nearly failed out of his elite preparatory school because he was too busy partying, I was the one forced to stay up until 3 a.m, doing his history papers and completing his math assignments while he slept off his hangovers in a custom-built king-sized bed. When he crashed that precious Porsche into a stone wall while driving under the influence, it was my college fund, the meager, pathetic savings I had managed to scrape together by tutoring the neighborhood kids, that was immediately drained to pay off the lawyers and keep it out of the papers. "It's for the family, Evelyn," my father had barked, his face red with whiskey and rage when I cried over the loss of my only ticket out. "Blood is blood. We sacrifice for each other. Stop crying and be useful for once in your miserable life." But they didn't sacrifice for me. They sacrificed me. Preston, naturally, grew up to be exactly what you would expect a profoundly pampered, zero-consequence narcissist to be. Completely and utterly useless. He dropped out of Princeton in his second year. He drifted from one entrepreneurial venture to another, each one more ridiculous and catastrophic than the last. He played at being a CEO while producing absolutely nothing of value, a leech perpetually attached to my parents' rapidly depleting vein. And then, the ultimate betrayal occurred. The money finally, completely ran out. The bank was circling the estate. Foreclosure was a matter of weeks away. Enter Richard Sterling. Richard was 32 at the time. I was 22. He was new money, loud, aggressive, ruthless, and utterly lacking in the refined social graces my parents supposedly prized above all else. But Richard had cash. Oceans of it. He wanted a young, beautiful, old money wife to legitimize his brutal ascent into high society, to act as an elegant hood ornament for his growing empire. My parents saw the opportunity, and they sold me to him without a second thought. I remember the day of my wedding. I was sitting in the bridal suite of the Plaza Hotel, suffocating in $80,000 of antique lace and pearls. I was terrified. I had already seen the darkness in Richard's eyes, the possessive, cruel grip of his hands when the cameras weren't flashing. I begged my mother to call it off. I wept, shaking so hard my teeth rattled, pleading with her to let me run away, promising I would get 3 jobs and pay off the house myself. My mother walked over, her face a mask of perfectly applied Chanel makeup, and gripped my shoulders so hard her manicured nails dug painfully into my collarbone. "Listen to me, you pathetic, ungrateful child," she whispered, her voice venomous. "We are drowning. Preston needs capital for his new startup. Your father's heart cannot take a bankruptcy. You are going to walk down that aisle, you are going to smile, and you are going to open your legs for that man. It is the very least you can do after everything we have provided for you." And so I walked. I walked down the aisle and into a 35-year sentence of psychological torture. For the first 25 years of my marriage, I was the financial mule for my toxic family. Richard's abuse was a daily, grinding reality. He belittled my intelligence, controlled my movements, and reminded me every single day that I was a peasant living in his castle. But the true agony was knowing that I was enduring this nightmare simply to fund the people who had thrown me to the wolves. Every time Preston started a new, doomed company, it was Evelyn who had to endure Richard's sneering, humiliating lectures to secure the investment check. Every time my parents needed to replace the roof on the estate or pay their exorbitant country club dues, it was Evelyn who had to swallow her pride, endure Richard's cruel jokes at dinner, and beg for the money. And how did my family repay this sacrifice? With absolute, unadulterated disrespect. They gladly cashed the checks, but they despised the hand that fed them. At family gatherings, they would mock me. "Oh, Evelyn doesn't understand hard work," Preston would laugh, swirling an expensive glass of cognac that I had bought for him. "She just lounges around in penthouses all day. Must be nice to be a professional trophy wife. Some of us actually have to be out in the trenches." My parents would nod in agreement, completely rewriting history, pretending that Preston was the true genius of the family and I was just the lucky, lazy girl who happened to marry rich. I was funding their entire existence, bleeding my soul dry every single day, and they still treated me like the dirt on the bottom of their designer shoes. The turning point. The moment the obedient, weeping victim inside me died and the architect of their destruction was born, happened exactly 10 years ago. It was Preston's 50th birthday. My parents had convinced me to ask Richard for a massive sum, $500,000, to bail Preston out of a disastrous commercial real estate loan he had defaulted on. If he didn't get the money, he was going to prison for fraud. I endured a week of Richard's horrific verbal abuse to secure that money. I was degraded. I was broken down. But I got the check. I drove in the pouring rain to the family estate. I walked into the drawing room and handed the envelope to Preston. He didn't say thank you. He snatched it from my hand, checked the amount, and smirked. "Took you long enough," he sneered. "Richard must have had you on a short leash this week." "God, Evelyn, look at you. You look exhausted. Try not to let yourself go, or Richard might trade you in for a younger model, and then where would we be?" He laughed. My mother, sitting by the fire, laughed with him. I stood there in the center of the room, listening to the crackle of the fire and the sound of my brother chuckling at the expense of my dignity. I looked at the envelope in his hand. I looked at my mother's complacent, vain face, and in that exact moment, something deep inside my chest snapped. It was not a loud break. It was a silent, profound severing of the final thread of loyalty I held for these monsters. I realized, with crystalline, horrifying clarity, that they would drain me until I was a dry, hollow husk. And then they would step over my corpse to ask Richard for a refill. I was not family. I was a limitless credit card attached to a punching bag. I did not scream. I did not cry. I smiled. A terrifying, genuine smile. "You're right, Preston," I said softly. "I should be more careful." I turned around and walked out of the house. I drove back to Manhattan, the rain lashing against the windshield, the tires gripping the asphalt. The victim who had entered that house was dead. The woman who drove away was a predator. That was the night I stopped crying and started planning. That was the night I realized that Richard's arrogance was his biggest blind spot. He thought I was stupid. He thought I was just the pretty, vacant face from a broke family. He left his financial documents scattered across his home office. He bragged about his over-leveraged properties, his risky shell corporations, and the massive, unsustainable debt he was taking on to build his fragile empire. I began to study. I spent my nights reading corporate law, market analysis, and private equity structures while he slept. I took the massive allowances he gave me, the money meant for designer clothes and my family's endless demands, and I began funneling it into completely untraceable offshore accounts under the name Vance Capital. When my family called begging for more money, I coldly told them Richard had cut me off. I let Preston go bankrupt. I let my parents lose their country club memberships. I listened to their frantic, abusive voicemails, and I felt absolutely nothing. Every dollar they were denied, every dollar Richard thought I was spending on meaningless luxuries was compounding. I became a ghost in the machine, quietly hiring the most cutthroat proxy attorneys in the world. I waited. I watched. I learned every single weakness in Richard's portfolio. And while the golden child faded into pathetic obscurity, and my parents drowned in the reality of their own incompetence, the scapegoat was quietly buying up the world. Which brings us right back to the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria. Right back to the moment the microphone dropped. Right back to the exact second Richard realized that the quiet, obedient wife he had abused for 35 years was the very monster who had just swallowed him whole. The silence in the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria did not simply break. It shattered, fracturing into a million jagged pieces of palpable, suffocating tension. For a span of perhaps 10 seconds, the world was completely suspended. The only sound was the agonizing, high-pitched ringing of the microphone feedback echoing from the towering speakers, a mechanical shriek that perfectly matched the internal panic violently erupting behind Richard's eyes. He stared at the heavily redacted executive summary resting on his pristine china dinner plate, his mind violently rejecting the reality of the ink on the page. His jaw, usually locked in a permanent, arrogant clench, hung slack. The deep, spray-tanned bronze of his skin had rapidly faded into a sickly, translucent gray, making the severe lines around his mouth look like deep, hollow craters. "What is this?" he stammered. The booming, theatrical baritone that had commanded the room just moments ago was entirely gone. In its place was the reedy, breathless squeak of a cornered animal. His trembling hand reached out, hovering over the watermarked paper as if touching it would burn him alive. This is a joke! A pathetic, ridiculous stunt!" I did not move a single muscle. I stood directly across from him, my posture as straight and unyielding as a marble column. I let him scramble. I let him thrash against the walls of the trap that had just snapped shut around him. "It is not a stunt, Richard," I replied, my voice a low, perfectly controlled murmur that somehow carried across the breathless silence of the front tables. "It is an eviction notice, and it is a financial autopsy of the rotting corpse you call an empire." "Liar!" he suddenly spat, slamming his fist against the mahogany table. The force of the blow rattled the crystal champagne flutes, sending a splash of vintage Dom Perignon spilling onto the pristine white silk tablecloth, staining it like a drop of golden blood. He looked up, his eyes wide and frantic, scanning the front row of gaping socialites, politicians, and business partners, desperately trying to reclaim his narrative. "She's insane! My wife has clearly had a psychological break. Security! Get someone in here to escort her to a hospital!" No one moved. Not the security guards stationed at the heavy oak doors, not the waitstaff frozen in the corners, and certainly not the guests. The elite of New York are sharks. They can smell blood in the water from a mile away, and right now, the water around Richard Sterling was turning a deep, violently opaque red. I reached back into my black Yves Saint Laurent clutch. I didn't break eye contact with him as I pulled out a thicker, heavier stack of documents, bound by a thick silver clip. "Let's walk through the exact nature of my psychological break, shall we?" I said smoothly, my voice carrying the crisp, undeniable authority of a CEO addressing a thoroughly incompetent subordinate. I undid the silver clip and let the stack of papers fan out across the table, covering his untouched roasted duck. 3 years ago, you leveraged the Sterling Tower in Midtown to secure a high-risk development loan for your luxury resort in Dubai, I began, my voice ringing out with terrifying clarity. A resort that, due to your legendary mismanagement and your refusal to listen to your own structural engineers, is currently a half-finished concrete skeleton sinking into the sand. You defaulted on that loan 90 days ago. The primary lender was ready to seize the Midtown Tower. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, catching the blinding light of the baccarat chandeliers. How do you know about Dubai?" he whispered hoarsely. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of an apex predator baring its teeth. "I know, Richard, because I bought the debt. Vance Capital purchased the entire portfolio of your distressed assets from the primary lender for 45 cents on the dollar." I tapped a perfectly manicured fingernail against the top document. "This is the deed of transfer. I own the Sterling Tower. I own the Dubai skeleton. And more importantly, I own the 60-story glass penthouse you are currently sleeping in." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the room. I heard the distinct sound of a silver fork clattering onto a porcelain plate at table 3, dropped by the mayor of New York himself. Richard staggered backward, bumping into his chair. He gripped the back of it, his knuckles turning stark white as he tried to keep his balance. You don't have that kind of capital," he wheezed, shaking his head violently in denial. "You're a housewife. You spend my money on clothes and charity lunches. You don't know the first thing about private equity." "I spent a fraction of your allowance on clothes, Richard," I corrected him calmly, taking a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing him to shrink back even further. "The rest of it, the millions you blindly transferred to my accounts to keep me quiet and complacent, was aggressively invested. I hired the most ruthless proxy firms in Manhattan. I shorted your failing stocks. I capitalized on every single idiotic, ego-driven blunder you made in the market over the last decade. While you were playing golf and bragging about your genius, I was building a guillotine." I paused, letting the sheer magnitude of his failure wash over him. "You haven't been a titan of industry for 10 years, Richard. You've been a puppet. And I have been holding every single string." Suddenly, a loud, abrasive voice cut through the stunned silence of the ballroom. "Evelyn! What in God's name do you think you are doing?" I turned my head slowly. Pushing his way past the bewildered guests at table 2 was my older brother, Preston. His face was flushed crimson with rage, his custom tuxedo looking strained around his expanding waistline. Following closely behind him were my parents, Eleanor and Thomas Vance, their faces masks of horrified, aristocratic scandal. "Stop this pathetic display immediately!" my mother hissed, rushing to Richard's side and glaring at me with the same cold, venomous contempt she had used to control me since I was a child. "Are you trying to ruin us? Richard is a generous man. Apologize to your husband right now, Evelyn. Have you completely lost your mind?" The final pieces of the puzzle had willingly stepped right into the crosshairs. I looked at the three of them, the architects of my suffering, the people who had sold me into this nightmare, who had bled me dry, who had treated me like a useless, dim-witted bank teller for 35 years. For a moment, I felt a familiar phantom ache in my chest. The ghost of the terrified little girl who just wanted her mother to love her, who just wanted her brother to protect her. But that girl had died a long time ago. The woman standing in her place felt nothing but the icy thrill of absolute execution. "Eleanor," I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing any trace of the polite daughter I had been conditioned to be. "Take one more step toward me, and I will have security throw you out into the street by the collar of your Chanel gown." My mother froze, genuinely shocked. In 45 years, I had never spoken to her with anything less than complete submission. Her mouth opened and closed like a landed fish, unable to formulate a response to this sudden, terrifying defiance. Preston, ever the arrogant, delusional golden child, puffed out his chest and stepped in front of our parents. "Don't you dare speak to Mother like that, you ungrateful little—" He started to snarl, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at my face. "Preston," I interrupted, my voice cracking through the air like a bullwhip. "I suggest you put your finger down and shut your mouth before I decide to publicly detail the financials of your current tech startup." Preston's hand froze midair. The belligerent rage vanished from his eyes, instantly replaced by a stark, naked panic. You don't know anything about Vanguard Logistics," he stammered, attempting to maintain his facade, though his voice wavered pathetically. "I know everything about Vanguard Logistics, Preston," I countered, taking a step toward him. "I know that it produces no software. I know that it has exactly 0 clients. And I know that 3 months ago, you took out a massive, predatory bridge loan from a shadowy, third-tier private equity group just to keep up the appearance that you are a successful CEO." I reached into my clutch one final time and pulled out a single, neatly folded envelope. I held it up in the blinding light of the chandeliers. "Guess who owns the private equity group that holds your loan, Preston?" I asked, tilting my head, watching his arrogant world collapse in real time. "Guess who has the discretionary power to call in the entirety of that debt immediately, due to the fraudulent revenue projections you submitted on your application?" Preston's knees actually buckled. He grabbed the edge of a nearby table to keep from collapsing onto the marble floor. "No," he whispered, his eyes wide, looking like a terrified child. "Evelyn, please. If you call that loan in, I'll go to federal prison for fraud." "I know," I said. The words were a flat, emotionless statement of fact. "And I don't care." I turned my devastating gaze back to my parents. They were huddled together, clinging to each other, realizing that the protective shield of my compliance had been permanently shattered. "And as for you two," I said, addressing Thomas and Eleanor, who were now trembling uncontrollably, "you sold me to a monster so you could keep your precious Connecticut estate. You forced me to endure 3 decades of psychological torture to fund your country club dues and your garden parties. You told me blood requires sacrifice." I walked slowly toward them. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, desperate to stay out of the blast radius of my wrath. 3 weeks ago, I continued, my voice echoing through the silent, captivated room. The bank finally initiated foreclosure on the Vance estate. You were millions in arrears. You were packing your bags in the dark, preparing to beg Richard for one last bailout tonight. My father let out a choked, pathetic sob, burying his face in his hands. My mother stared at me, tears of absolute terror streaking her perfect makeup. "Richard can't bail you out," I whispered, leaning in so only they could hear the final, lethal blow. "Because he has nothing. And the bank won't extend your mortgage because I bought the property from the bank yesterday morning. The estate is mine. The very ground you walk on belongs to the daughter you threw away. You have exactly 30 days to clear out your possessions before the bulldozers arrive to demolish that rotting, toxic house." I stepped back, taking in the full tableau of the destruction I had meticulously orchestrated. Richard was slumped against his chair, a broken, bankrupt old man, staring vacantly at the documents that had erased his existence. Preston was hyperventilating, the reality of impending federal charges crushing his chest. My parents were weeping openly, the illusion of their aristocratic superiority violently stripped away, leaving them as nothing more than broke, desperate frauds in front of New York's elite. The power in the room had shifted entirely. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the victim. I was the executioner, and I had just swung the axe with flawless precision. I turned my back on my screaming, weeping family. I looked out at the sea of 160 guests. The sneers, the patronizing smiles, and the mocking whispers were completely gone. In their place was absolute, unadulterated awe and fear. They understood, in that moment, exactly who was the most powerful person in the room. I looked down at Richard one last time. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a pathetic, desperate pleading that disgusted me to my very core. "Evelyn," he rasped, reaching a trembling hand out toward my dress. "Please, 35 years. You can't just..." I didn't even let him finish the sentence. I simply turned on my heel, the sharp click of my stilettos cutting through his pathetic whimpers. "Watch me," I said. There is a specific, intoxicating weightlessness that occurs the exact moment a lifetime of invisible chains finally snap. For 35 years, gravity in Richard Sterling's world had been oppressive. It was a dense, suffocating force that pushed my shoulders down, kept my eyes lowered, and demanded that my voice never rise above a compliant, polite whisper. But as I turned my back on the grand, glittering table at the center of the Waldorf Astoria ballroom, that gravity simply ceased to exist. I did not run. I did not storm out in a flurry of emotional chaos. I moved with the slow, deliberate, and terrifying grace of a queen who had just comfortably executed a hostile takeover of her own life. The sharp, rhythmic click, click, click of my black Christian Louboutin stilettos striking the imported Italian marble floor was the only sound cutting through the stunned, breathless vacuum of the room. It sounded like a metronome counting down the final seconds of my imprisonment. Behind me, the symphony of destruction was just beginning to tune its instruments. I could hear the wet, ragged sound of my father, Thomas, hyperventilating, his aristocratic facade crumbling into a pathetic pile of impending bankruptcy. I could hear my mother, Eleanor, whispering frantically, her voice trembling with the raw, unfamiliar sting of absolute powerlessness. I could hear Preston, the golden child, letting out a low, pathetic moan as the reality of federal fraud charges wrapped its cold fingers around his throat. And then there was Richard. "Evelyn, you cannot do this. I am your husband. I am Richard Sterling," he screamed. His voice was no longer the booming, terrifying roar that had rattled the windows of our home for 3 decades. It was shrill. It was desperate. It was the sound of a man who was entirely empty inside, suddenly realizing that the woman he had used to fill the void had just taken everything with her. The sound of his frantic, scrambling panic echoed off the towering baccarat crystal chandeliers, but it did not reach me. It hit my back and fell to the floor, as harmless and insignificant as dust. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead. The sea of 160 elite guests, the politicians, the ruthless developers, the socialite wives who had spent years politely sneering at me behind their champagne flutes, parted before me like the Red Sea. They scrambled backward, pulling their silk gowns and tailored tuxedo jackets out of my path, terrified that even brushing against my emerald silk dress would catch them in the blast radius of my absolute, unyielding vengeance. I looked at their faces as I walked in slow, cinematic perfection down the center aisle. I saw the mayor of New York, a man who had laughed at Richard's cruel jokes just 20 minutes prior, standing frozen, his mouth slightly open in profound, unadulterated awe. I saw the wives of Richard's competitors, women who had dismissed me as a brainless trophy, staring at me with a sudden, fierce reverence burning in their eyes. They weren't looking at Evelyn the victim anymore. They were looking at Evelyn the apex predator. They were looking at the sole proprietor of Vance Capital. I reached the end of the ballroom. The heavy, ornate oak doors loomed before me. For years I had walked through these doors a dozen paces behind Richard, my head bowed, my spirit crushed. 2 massive security guards, men whose salaries Richard believed he paid, stood at attention. They looked at me, then looked past me at the sweating, weeping, ruined man at the head table. Then, with a synchronized, respectful nod, they reached out and pulled the heavy oak doors open for me. I stepped out of the ballroom and into the grand, sprawling Art Deco lobby of the Waldorf Astoria. The heavy doors swung shut behind me with a solid, resounding thud, instantly silencing the chaotic, pathetic cries of my former family. The contrast was immediate and physical. Inside that ballroom was the past, a rotting, toxic terrarium of abuse, gaslighting, and financial parasitic behavior. Out here, in the cool, serene expanse of the lobby, the air felt clean. It felt expansive. I walked across the intricate mosaic floors, past the towering marble columns and the lavish floral arrangements that smelled of fresh, untainted lilies. Every step I took felt like shedding a layer of heavy, suffocating armor I no longer needed to wear. I took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with air that belonged entirely to me. I wasn't carrying Richard's ego anymore. I wasn't carrying my parents' desperate need for status. I wasn't carrying Preston's catastrophic failures. My shoulders dropped. My spine straightened to its absolute fullest height. As I approached the main entrance, the polished revolving glass doors spun effortlessly. I stepped through them and walked out into the crisp, electric Manhattan night. The city that never sleeps was alive, pulsating with a neon, chaotic energy that suddenly felt like it was beating in perfect synchronization with my own heart. The air was cool, carrying the faint metallic scent of rain and exhaust, the gritty, beautiful perfume of absolute reality. The blinding, chaotic flash of paparazzi cameras that usually waited to capture Richard's arrogant smirk were nowhere to be seen. The street was beautifully, blissfully ordinary. I walked down the shallow stone steps to the valet stand. The young valet, a boy in a crisp red uniform, hurried forward. He had parked my cars 100 times before, always addressing me with a nervous, deferential, "Mrs. Sterling." He stopped a few feet from me, holding a sleek black key fob. He looked at my face, sensing the profound tectonic shift in my aura. He didn't say the name of the man I had just legally erased. "Your car, Miss Vance," he said, his voice quiet, offering the keys with a polite bow. "Thank you, David," I replied, the corners of my mouth lifting into my first genuine, untethered smile in 35 years. I reached out and took the keys. Waiting for me at the curb was not the ostentatious, chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce Richard insisted we take to events. It was a custom, matte obsidian Aston Martin DBS Superleggera. It was a machine built for raw, unapologetic power, a low, aggressive predator resting quietly under the glow of the street lamps. I had bought it 3 days ago, in cash, entirely in my own name. It was the antithesis of Preston's pathetic, crashed Porsche. It was a declaration of absolute independence. I opened the heavy door and slid into the driver's seat. The cabin smelled of rich, dark leather and new beginnings. I tossed my Yves Saint Laurent clutch, the small black envelope that had successfully detonated a billion-dollar empire, onto the passenger seat. I pressed my foot against the brake and pushed the ignition button. The V12 engine didn't just start. It roared. It was a deep, guttural, symphonic growl that vibrated up through the steering wheel and straight into my bones. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated freedom. I shifted into drive, gripped the hand-stitched leather steering wheel, and pulled away from the curb. The tires gripped the asphalt with aggressive precision. I didn't look back. I didn't glance at the grand awning of the Waldorf Astoria. The people bleeding out inside that building were ghosts. They belonged to a history book I had just slammed shut and locked forever. I drove. I merged onto Park Avenue, the matte black Aston Martin gliding through the glowing arteries of the city like a shadow. I rolled the driver's side window down, completely uncaring that the wind was tearing through my perfect, salon-styled hair. The cold night air whipped against my face, stinging my cheeks, awakening every single nerve ending in my body. It was exhilarating. It was the breath of life returning to a corpse. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror as I paused at a red light. I didn't see the hollow, exhausted, terrified woman who used to stare back at me from the gilded mirrors of the estate. I saw a woman with eyes like polished obsidian. I saw a survivor. I saw an architect of justice. I pressed the accelerator as the light turned green, the powerful engine roaring as I navigated the glittering, canyon-like streets of Midtown. Every skyscraper I passed, every glowing window, was a testament to the world I had just conquered. 15 minutes later, I pulled into the private subterranean garage of the Sterling Tower, a building that, as of tomorrow morning, would officially be rebranded as Vance Tower. The security gates recognized my plates and opened instantly. I parked the Aston Martin in the premier executive spot, the spot Richard had fiercely guarded for a decade. I took the private elevator, using my newly coded biometric access to bypass the executive suites and head straight for the penthouse. The doors slid open with a soft electronic chime. I stepped into my new sanctuary. The 60-story penthouse was a masterpiece of modern, minimalist architecture. There were no heavy floral perfumes, no oppressive antique furniture, no claustrophobic reminders of aristocratic desperation. There were only soaring, floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking the magnificent, sprawling expanse of the Manhattan skyline. I walked slowly across the wide plank oak floors, my heels echoing softly in the massive, quiet space. I walked straight to the sliding glass doors and stepped out onto the sprawling wraparound terrace. The wind up here was stronger, untamed by the streets below. I walked to the edge of the glass balustrade and placed my hands on the cool metal railing. I looked out over the millions of twinkling lights stretching across the island, a massive electric ocean that I now firmly held in the palm of my hand. Far down below, somewhere in the tangled grid of the city, Richard was likely being escorted out of a ballroom he no longer owned. My parents were likely they were shrinking. In my mind's eye, the toxic, arrogant, abusive family that had consumed my entire existence was rapidly dissolving into nothingness, like sugar in boiling water. They were gone. They had entirely lost the privilege of my presence, my resources, and my mind. I stood on the balcony, a self-made titan in an emerald silk dress, bathing in the absolute, beautiful silence of my own making. I closed my eyes, feeling the wind against my skin, listening to the distant rhythmic hum of the city. The war was over. The scapegoat had not just survived the fire, she had become the inferno. And as I opened my eyes and looked out over my empire, I knew with absolute, untouchable certainty that I would never, ever be cold again. The sun did not simply rise over Manhattan the next morning. It arrived like a golden coronation. I woke up in the master suite of the Vance Tower, wrapped in Egyptian cotton, to a silence so profound and pure it felt like a physical embrace. For 35 years, my mornings had been dictated by the erratic, terrifying moods of a tyrant and the endless, parasitic demands of a family that viewed me as nothing more than a human ATM. My mornings had been filled with the anxious, nauseating knot in the pit of my stomach, the desperate, exhausting calculation of how I was going to survive another 24 hours in a gilded cage without setting off a landmine. But today, there were no landmines. There was only the quiet hum of the city far below and the undeniable, rock-solid certainty that my life finally belonged exclusively to me. By 9 a.m., the financial news networks were already breaking the story. The absolute, catastrophic collapse of Richard Sterling's real estate empire was the headline on every single screen. Analysts were baffled, scrambling to understand how a seemingly invincible titan had been so quietly and efficiently dismantled by an unknown private equity firm overnight. They called it a ruthless, unprecedented hostile takeover. They called it a masterclass in corporate execution. They didn't know the half of it. They didn't know that the executioner was the woman who had poured their coffee, ironed their shirts, and funded their delusions for 3.5 decades. I turned off the television. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, walked out onto the sprawling glass terrace, and looked down at the world. And it is from this exact spot, standing at the summit of my own reclaimed life, that I need to speak directly to you. Yes, you. The person watching this video who is currently sitting in a room, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of a toxic family pressing down on your chest. Society has sold us a deeply dangerous, fundamentally flawed lie. We are force-fed this romanticized, unbreakable narrative that family is everything. We are told from the moment we can comprehend language that blood is thicker than water, that we must honor our parents, and that we must endlessly forgive our siblings because they are family. We are conditioned to believe that society tells us to be the bigger person. Society tells us to keep the peace. But let me ask you something. Whose peace are you actually keeping? Because I can guarantee you, it is not your own. When you endlessly forgive people who actively, aggressively choose to hurt you, you are not being the bigger person. You are simply giving them permission to continue the abuse. You are handing them the knife and offering them a better angle. We need to rewrite the entire dictionary of human relationships right here, right now. Blood does not equal a blank check. Sharing a genetic lineage with someone does not grant them a lifetime. For decades, I believed that my value was intrinsically tied to my usefulness. I believed that if I but emotional vamp, the greatest, and the exact same is true for you. You are not the problem. You are the scapegoat because you possess the light, the empathy, and the strength that they completely lack. They target you because your very existence is a mirror that reflects their own miserable, insecure reality back at them. They try to break you because they are terrified of what you would accomplish if you ever realized how truly powerful you are. Listen to me very carefully. Walking away from toxic people is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. It is the most beautiful, sacred form of self-love you can ever practice. There is no nobility in suffering. There is no grand reward waiting for you at the end of your life for being the best, most compliant punching bag. Your life is happening right now, in this exact moment. And you have the absolute, undeniable right to spend it surrounded by people who celebrate your presence, who respect your boundaries, and who bring peace to your spirit. You do not owe your abusers an explanation. You do not owe them a transition period. And you certainly do not owe them your future. The moment you decide to pack up your dignity and walk away from the table where respect is no longer being served, the universe will dramatically shift to meet you. When you stop pouring your precious energy into a black hole of toxic family dynamics, you can finally start channeling that energy into building your own empire. Whether that empire is a billion-dollar private equity firm, a quiet, peaceful home filled with chosen family, or simply a mind that is finally free from anxiety, it is yours. And no one can ever take it from you. I want to look out at this incredible, growing community we are building right now. If my story resonated with you today, if you felt that familiar spark of righteous anger and the thrilling rush of absolute vindication, I need you to make your voice heard. Go down into the comments section right now. I want to read your stories. Have you ever had to draw a hard line in the sand with a toxic parent, a narcissistic sibling, or an abusive partner? What was the final straw that made you realize blood does not equal a blank check? How did you find the monumental courage to finally walk away and choose yourself? Share your journey, your story. The exact words you type today might be the definitive lifeline that another person desperately needs to read to finally break their own chains. We heal by shining a blinding light on the darkness they tried to hide us in. Hit that like button to show the algorithm that we are done suffering in silence. Let the world see the sheer volume of survivors who are taking their power back. And most importantly, hit that subscribe button. Join this channel. We are not just telling stories here. We are building an army of fierce, independent, unapologetic individuals who absolutely refuse to be victims. We are building a sanctuary for the scapegoats, the black sheep, and the survivors who are ready to become the CEOs of their own destinies. Thank you for standing with me today. Thank you for witnessing the fall of an empire and the rise of a queen. Remember to always guard your peace with absolute ferocity. Know your profound worth, and never, ever apologize for protecting your own life. I will see you in the next video. Keep building your empire.